But first, we have to look ahead to Wednesday, to the match against Viktoria Plzeň. It sounds like rotation is in the air. Rafa, what say you?
I think it is, but I'm going to go the opposite way. While everybody might think this is the perfect game to rotate, it's Viktoria Plzeň, however you say it, at the Camp Nou. But in my opinion, this is a really important game, and because let's face it, anything less than the 3 points, and all hell is gonna break loose in Barcelona Twitter and whatnot. Because after that, it's Inter, Bayern. I don't know how it goes. I think it's Bayern, Inter, Bayern. So we have to win. Like, a draw at the Camp Nou is basically a defeat. And I know we talked about this last time I was here after the Champions League draw. More like, people are gonna give Bayern have Bayern as the winners of the group, and then it's gonna be between Inter and Barcelona for that second spot, or at least that's what the majority of people think. So if either Inter or us slip against Viktoria Plzeň, then it's really an uphill battle, because again, if we don't win, so that I don't think there, in my opinion, there might be a lot of rotations. I'm not saying there won't be, but in my opinion, if I was Xavi, I wouldn't mess around with this game, knowing that we then have to play Bayern, Inter, Bayern. Like, we have to win. Yeah, maybe 1 or 2 rotations, but like put Ferran in. Obviously Lewandowski's gonna play. Like Ansu Fati, I think Ansu could maybe get a start at the Camp Nou, but then I don't know, start Kessie. Like rotating a lot. Honestly, I would not rotate maybe 1 or 2 players, but that's it. To me, this is a trap game.
Well, I don't know. I think in the past, I think there is real merit, but for the first time, and I was thinking about the length of time too. So for the first time since I've been doing this podcast, so when we're talking about social media and these things that don't really exist that exist outside of the club completely. They exist outside of decisions that are made by Xavi, even by the board, even actually by those who are prattling it on in the Catalan newspapers. Like, this is just like everything about this rotation is internal. And while that argument I think has merit, for the first time in many years, I think Barca they have enough capable players that Xavi, I think he needs I understand the importance of the game, but in the long run, he needs to keep everybody fresh and rotated, and he can still trust that there won't be much of a drop-off, right? Like, we're really talking when we talk about rotation is how much of a drop-off there's going to be. And what I know about this squad that has been assembled in this transfer window, for which, by the way, I gave an A+ to on the video I did about the full grade, that 20-minute manifesto I made last week. But, this A+ transfer window that just occurred, this is a squad that is built to not only be able to be fully capable of taking this game with 5 rotations, but also capable of taking points off Inter comfortably and potentially taking points off Bayern. Like, that is how good this squad is. And it's one of those things where this squad needs to just show up and take care of business against this team. And then they can also try to take care with their Gala 11 or with their best 11 against Bayern, against Inter. They fully have the ability to do that. I mean, it's just watching the way they started this season. But even, like, rotation, right? Like, what are we talking about here, right? Garcia limped off, so we know that we probably won't see him. And then probably Araujo will also be rotated for Christensen. But Christensen might not be fully healthy. So it still just might be Koundé and Araujo as the center back pairing. That doesn't really feel like rotation to me, even though it's going to be, right? And then you have Bellerin and Roberto. One of them will start next to that duo. I don't even think it's going to be Bellerin. People are saying that is, like, I don't know. People are, like, assuming that he's going to be way above Roberto on the depth chart. But I keep saying this 100 times over. I think Bellerin was added for depth. It's a 1-year deal. I think Roberto is your first, or let's say he's your 1B or 2A right back, with Koundé and Araujo being, 1A and 1B there, or Koundé being 1A there. So, I think it could be Roberto. And at this point, I'd expect, usually in normal seasons, as I said, I would expect the manager to finally give Balde his chance. But he's a starter, so I'm not sure if Afonso is ready. And then again, now you have a back line of Alba, Araujo, Koundé, and Roberto. And again, that feels not like rotation, even though it is based on the first 3 matches of the season we saw. In the midfield, Gabi is probably out for De Jong. Is Gabi for De Jong really truly feel like that crazy rotation, right? And then the big one I think would be if Pedri is sat. I don't think it's going to happen, but if Pedri is sat for Kessié, right? Because that De Jong, Boosie, Kessié, it's kind of a weird midfield. However, if you're going to put a midfield who's losing the creativity of Pedri, and they just other than Busquets really being the creator from deep, you don't really have that much creativity. You have just guys who are going to not only win the ball back, but do have some movement, have some dribbling ability. And again, I'm interested to see what would happen with Kessié, because I think he can take more of an offensive burden, but I wonder what would happen if he was tasked to be the main creator in that final third, right, as the attacking midfielder, if you will. And then for the forwards, I think you still have Rafinha and Lewandowski. They're not getting rotated. I think Dembele is the one to get rotated. And then, Ferran Torres has to get the nod, and Ansu will come in when he usually comes in, just like Xavi's promising. And I also expect some Memphis to buy late on in the game. Pjanic looks set for the Middle East, so I don't think we're going to see him, but which could mean that Pablo Torre, I expect and want to see him late in the match, as in he'll be a sub-rotation and the fifth sub depending on how the game is going. So with the starting lineup that I think is going tipping Xavi's hand here, in that rotation you're adding De Jong, you're adding Roberto, you're back adding Alba or potentially even Christensen, maybe not Christensen, and you're adding Ferran Torres, and that's pretty much it. And that doesn't feel like rotation to me.
No,
you're adding players that would normally start anyway.
Technically, it doesn't. I agree, and I know that on paper we should beat Viktoria Plzeň at the Camp Nou. But
and if Ferran Torres, let me throw that one out to do. If Ferran Torres cannot be trusted as a starter against Viktoria Plzeň, we have to be serious. At some point, he obviously wasn't going to start against Sevilla, right? Who knew what would happen? Sevilla, who knew they were as trash as what they are? We'll get to that, but against Viktoria Plzeň of the Czech First League, Ferran Torres has to be a player.
What worries me is because obviously on paper we should win and by a comfortable margin. But what worries me is a Rayo 2.0, the typical game that you're supposed to win comfortably at the Camp Nou. I'm not saying we're gonna lose, but a draw, like I said earlier, it would be seen as a horrible result. So
terrible. Yeah,
I don't want this game to be the typical game that the opponent at the Camp Nou just sits back, absorbs. The keeper just becomes a reincarnation of Yashin, and at the end of the 50 minutes, we're so desperate trying to score that one goal because we know we can't draw against Viktoria Plzeň at the Camp Nou, and then everybody gets nervous. That extra touch isn't good, etc., etc. So I don't think, given the fact that I think Viktoria Plzeň are gonna sit back and defend for the most part, I don't think we could have the luxury of leaving Pedri out, knowing that he's one of the few people that can unlock that defense that is gonna sit back. So that's why I'm not being pessimistic, but I think this is the typical game that if you don't approach it the right way and just think, we're just going to run over these guys, it can get complicated and quickly evolve into a Rayo 2.0 situation that now we're just desperate at minute 70, bringing in Memphis, Ansu, and just trying to get that goal because then it's oh my God, now we got Bayern, then we got Inter, then Bayern. So that's the aspect that I want to get at. That's why I'm worrying a little bit about tomorrow. I mean, Wednesday.
But I also think that takes a very myopic view of the Champions League, because the next match after that, looking ahead, is Cadiz. And Cadiz is, you and I can start as part of another, the way Cadiz is playing right now, you and I can.
I would rotate rotate, quote unquote, given the explanation that you said.
Yeah.
If there was a game that we should rotate between Viktoria Plzeň and the Camp Nou, knowing who we have to face after that in the group stage, and Cadiz, I would rotate way 100 times against Cadiz instead of Viktoria Plzeň.
But that's what I wonder, though, because I think that's the argument here about the Champions League, that Barcelona should be in. You have 6 games to get enough points to win a second in your group in the Champions League. And I think Barcelona, to me, there's actually more confidence of doing that. And it's actually more destructive to their long-term success this season in La Liga to get that draw, or heavily rotate, if you will, against Cadiz. Because a draw against Cadiz at this point in the season, dropping 2 points after losing those 2 points against Rayo, that puts you way behind Real Madrid. And at this point, in the way we've seen Real Madrid and Barca start this Liga season, it's going to be, I mean, honestly, I think 95, 97 points. Like, that's what we're talking about, the winner this year in the Liga. I think one of these two teams is going to flirt with 100 points because the gap is just so far right now between the top two and everybody else. So I think, like, just even drawing Cadiz in the long run might be worse to one of your trophies than, not that a draw against, obviously, you're right, Viktoria Plzeň, like, getting a draw at home would be a nightmare there. But again, even the lineup that Cadiz can throw out there is better, or, you know, we'll say more established players on paper and have more name cachet than even Viktoria Plzeň. And, like, you know me, like, for many times on this, years, I always say, do not take your opponent for granted, right? And I'm not trying to take Viktoria Plzeň for granted. But, like, I'm trying to do my homework on them, right? I was going to do a YouTube video where I do my Champions League preview. But I can't, like, no offense to them, but I can't. Because they beat HJK from Finland. They beat Sheriff from Moldova, who, by the way, beat Real Madrid last year in the group stage. I always try to mention that. And then Karabakh from Azerbaijan, who has, both of which have been, that being Sheriff and Karabakh, who've been in recent group stages. And but Barcelona, they need to beat a team in the Czech First League, second in the Czech First League right now. So their top players, it's funny you mentioned goalkeepers, is Jindřich Stenek. He is their probably the most successful player. He's their highest market value and the one they trust the most. So, yeah, ironically enough, their best player is actually the goalkeeper. Defensive midfielder Lukas Kalvic is one of their big players, if you will. Center midfielder Pavel Bucha and center back Lucas Hedja. They all are worth, we'll say, we're worth the most. Like, their market value is the most. They've had the most success throughout their careers at other teams. So, yes, their top four players are all defensive-minded players, interestingly enough. Left winger Juan Mosquera, who older fans will almost remember here. He was actually part of the Hercules squad that beat the unbeatable Barcelona in 2011, but he actually wasn't because he was out on loan and never played a single game for Hercules. So he was supposed to, and he actually, like, wrote this long thing in the early days of Twitter about, like, Barca, down with Barca, because he was rooting for Hercules in that match and so excited that his parent club had done that. But again, his parent club never even gave him a match. But he did spend the majority of his career bouncing around the Czech league or his native Colombia. And that is, like, where he made his living, and he's their best attacker on the wing. So, you know, all right, everybody wake back up. I want to wake everybody up again. I'm done talking about Viktoria Plzeň. But again, that's why I couldn't even do a match review. I mean, a match preview, because there's not much to say about this team. They're going to do exactly what you said they're going to do, likely have five at the back. And they're going to just dig in, and they're going to hope that they get
I agree with you that, sadly, like, if we focus too much, quote unquote, like, let's say on tomorrow, the game against Viktoria Plzeň, then we got to play against Cadiz away. And sadly, in my opinion, that's the ugly truth of being drawn to the group that we were drawn to, unlike other teams that I won't mention. Sadly, when you're in a group in the Champions League that you gotta fight your way to, quote unquote, finish second, that, like, inevitably that's gonna affect how you play in the league. And that was my biggest worry about this group. Not that, because I think Barcelona are going to advance to the next stage. It's just how much trying to advance to the next stage within this group is going to affect your league run. Because after Cadiz, we got to play Bayern in Germany.
Yeah, it gets
so
hard.
It's those little things that it affects the way you planificar in Spanish. Will coordinate a little bit how you rotate in the league. Like, Madrid won't have that problem because their group is way easier than ours. So that's why that thought of, like, oh, for you to win the Champions League, you got to beat everybody. You got to beat the best. I mean, not technically. Like, when people win the Champions League, nobody goes, oh, this team. You don't get two more Champions Leagues or three if you had a tougher road or not. That doesn't matter whatsoever. So, sadly, it's the ugly truth, and why no one wants to be drawn into a difficult group at the start, because that affects how you do in your league, whether you like it or not. So, It is the ugly truth of being drawn in a group with Bayern and Inter.
The one thing I will also say about this particular Champions League campaign that feels entirely different is, I didn't do the research on this. I didn't look back at previous matches. I don't think Robert Lewandowski has ever lost this match. Does that make sense? Like, I don't think Robert Lewandowski has ever been at home and lost this match, right? Like, I don't think that happens. Like, I think even though, he needs service to score against any team, especially a team that has everybody behind the ball, but I just, like, there is something about Robert Lewandowski, even in like recently against Sevilla, against whoever, that says to me like, I mean, yes, 0-0 against Rayo Vallecano, that was one thing, but once he figured out how to put the ball in the back of the net for official matches, especially Barcelona, like it's a wrap. You know what I mean? And I think he affords you the opportunity to rotate a bit, right? Like with Rafinha and Lewandowski, like again, Ferran Torres, like just whoever, like name somebody. But again, Ferran Torres is supposed to be a good player too, and Memphis or wherever it may be. So the last little note about this, again, Pablo Torre, we're talking about him here. Again, I really want to see him here because it doesn't seem like he's going to always be featuring for Barça Athletic. I think they're trying to reincorporate him back in. But yeah, I mean, he's not too sold on that. And it was kind of like, it feels like the Alex Callado thing from the fall, except he wasn't registered at all last year. So he winds up not playing until he goes on loan to Granada. But yeah, Torre just kind of being stuck in limbo here. He's able to play in the Champions League, but because he's still registered with Barça Athletic, he's limited to what he could do in actual La Liga competition. Yeah, so that's frustrating on that end. And then the final note here is while the academy heads would lose their minds, like absolutely lose their minds, if they saw 15-year-old Lamine Yamal play in the Champions League, I want to remind people that he did train with the first team this week, but he will be in the UEFA Youth League, which again is still a U19 competition. And that's still nuts. It's still nuts for a 15-year-old to be playing in the U19 competition. So I want to preface all that. So we have a few more years to wait for Lamine Yamal in the actual Champions League. But yeah, he did train with the first team for the first time, and I just want to update people on that. Like, yeah, he's 15. But again, I want to remind you, like Gavi came up at 16, Ansu came up at 16, Pedri played a whole season at like 50 games at 16. Or 16 to 17. He still played 30 games for Las Palmas at 16. So I want to remind you that he's 15, but all of a sudden he's going to be signing that professional contract in less than a year. And then all of a sudden now he's like eligible to play for the first team, and we'll see what happens.